Hello and welcome to our first and probably only podcast episode on our channel Policy Popcorn. I'm Lisa Petzina and I'm joined by my co-host
Sebastian Fürst.
And today we'll be diving into a topic that has been at the forefront of European politics for years now, namely migration and asylum policies. And for this we will take a look at the new Migration and Asylum Pact. With the EU elections that happened in June, this topic was and is still very significant.
That's right, Lisa. Migration has always been a controversial topic, and with the rise of populist and right-wing parties, it's only getting more complex. Let's start by discussing the political landscape and how migration has become a highly discussed issue. The EU elections are very important to consider here, especially with the rise of far-right parties. For instance, the Fratelli d'Italia, which were polling at 29% in Italy, the FPÖ in Austria at 25%, Germany's AfD at 16%, and Le Pen's France Rassemblement National at 32%. This increase can also be observed in the European fractions, with the Identity and Democracy Group gaining 9 seats and the European Conservatives and Reformists Group gaining 14 seats compared to the last election.
Yeah, and there's also even a new group forming called the Patriots of Europe, right?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Before we take a more detailed look onto the new Migration and Asylum Pact, let's just look back for a second and consider some facts on the topic of migration.
Sounds good.
Yeah, so in 2015-2016, the humanitarian crisis saw a massive influx of migrants, particularly through the Mediterranean Sea. And this path of migration over the Mediterranean Sea was something that was very prominent in the news during that time. And we looked up some numbers which state that there have been about 30,000 deaths since 2014, which makes this one of the most lethal borders, actually.
Really, 30,000, that's horrible to hear. And I think in 2015 there have been over 1 million refugees arriving in the European Union, right?
Yeah, that's right. And some more interesting numbers that we also looked up are the ones of irregular crossings, which is an important issue that is also addressed in the new reform that we'll talk about. And in 2023 alone, there were about 380,000 irregular crossings. And the new Pact on Asylum and Migration will replace the old Dublin system, which placed the responsibility on the first EU country of arrival. So the Dublin system consists of the Dublin Regulation and the Eurodac for identifying arrivals. And the Dublin Regulation before the new Act is the third regulation, which builds on the previous two, and it prevents asylum seekers from submitting asylum applications for multiple member states of the EU, and gives responsibility for the refugee to the country of first application. So this put the countries of the EU external borders, such as Italy or Greece, under immense pressure in the past. And this is something the new reform wants to renew. And yeah, this pact was discussed for about 8 years, actually.
Like 8 years, that's really long. And this failure to renew the Dublin regulation is seen as a really significant policy failure, which was also pointed out by Ariadna Ripoll-Servant, which is a researcher in Salzburg. And she said that the European Parliament had already formed a united stance during the 2015 and 2016 crisis to reform the Dublin system, but due to the European Council's dominant role, the Parliament's decision-making was limited. She called this process the shadow of hierarchy, and states that it's one reason why it took so long to implement this reform, because parliaments had no chance to do it.
Yeah, 8 years, that's a crazy long amount of time, to say the least. And it also shows how difficult it can be to find consensus in the EU. The COVID-19 pandemic also influenced this for sure and prolonged the discussions.
Yeah, true.
But now let's take a closer look onto the new Migration and Asylum Pact. Sebastian, do you want to start with one of the pillars of the reform?
Yeah, sure. So the first pillar is that the pact aims to secure the external borders with robust screening processes. For this, the member states want to create a common asylum database known as Eurodoc, which should be implemented in order to identify all arriving refugees, and with that there should be quicker crisis action and funding in case a lot of refugees are arriving and some country needs financial support. And what stays the same is that the reform states that only people fleeing, for example, from prosecution due to race, religion, or fleeing from war have the right to asylum. So it's still based on the Geneva Refugee Convention from the last century.
Yeah, and the pact also aims to make procedures faster and more efficient, and it should also ensure clear asylum rules, guaranteeing people's rights through adequate living conditions and integration processes, and also preventing abuse in the EU all over. And they moreover want to have more harmonized criteria across the member states of the EU, which then should result into an overall fairer system.
Yeah, that's on paper it sounds great. And this reform is based on values such as solidarity and responsibility according to the values of the European Union. And the pact first proposes a permanent solidarity framework for migration and offers operational and financial support for all member states, and has clearer rules on the asylum application responsibilities. It also wants to prevent secondary movements, which means that if a migrant is arriving in one country, they cannot flee to another EU country, which was often the case with the Dublin regulations. And the migration should be embedded into international partnerships and preventing irregular departures. It should fight smuggling and foster cooperation on readmission. Yes, and other important ways for the pact is the creation of legal pathways for migration to ensure safe and regulated processes.
Yeah, exactly. So the pact was passed with 322 votes in favor, 266 against, and 31 abstentions. So now we will look at the attitudes of some of the EU fractions that were depicted in a text by Vittoria Meissner. And we decided to only talk about the EPP, the Left, and the ID, because those fractions will be relevant in a second, where we will discuss some speeches by 4 members of parliament.
Right. So the EPP supports securing borders and limiting illegal migrations, while the Left emphasizes on safe migration path and protecting fundamental human rights. The Identity and Democracy Group, they are supporting the so-called Fortress Europe, which aims to speed up migrant returns and securing the external borders, and in general taking a really anti-migration and refugee position.
Yeah. And now Sebastian and I watched, prior to this episode, we watched the speeches in the parliament that were held prior to the vote on the reform, and we selected 4 members, which we will discuss now more closely. We will start with Thomas Hübbe from the EPP. And he is in favor of the pact, mainly because it fosters trust between the EU countries and its citizens, and also leads to more control within migration processes due to the regulations of the pact. And he especially criticizes, though, the Green and the left-wing parties for working against it. And this becomes very evident in the following statement.
To turn to the left group and the Greens group. You very often give speeches about the far right. But the truth is, today you want to stop the migration pact together with Le Pen and AfD.
Fitting to these accusations, we will now consider the standpoint of Malin Björk from the left. And she criticizes the pact for still placing most responsibility on the first country of arrival, as the hotspots will stay the same, according to her. And moreover, the pact is also lacking real solidarity and does not stop the deaths at sea.
There won't be an automatic redistribution of those seeking protection. The first country of arrival will still be responsible. There's no real solidarity built in here. Nothing is being done, absolutely nothing, to stop the death in the Mediterranean.
Tom Vandendriesche from the Identity and Democracy made really strong anti-migration statements and is strongly against the pact, which is summarized with his following speech.
Replacing the European population, the colonization of Europe, the suicide of our unique civilization. Our borders must be closed.
Contrary to this, Pedro Marques from the S&D called the pact a step into the right direction, and he strongly supports it. And he stresses that they need to deliver for the EU citizens who want a better migration pact, and he argues that that's what they do.
Easy to come here and criticize the pact, the migration pact. It is obviously not perfect, but it is a compromise, a moment in which Europe stops dragging its feet on migration, and therefore it is a positive moment.
So as you can see, there are very different opinions on the pact. So Sebastian, what are your thoughts on this?
I also believe that the pact is a good start to improve the asylum system in the European Union, as Marques just said. But even though I agree with the left and the Greens that the pact still needs further improvement, I think it would not have been useful to prolong the discussions even further. I think 8 years are already a really, really long time to make a change. And the EU has to start somewhere, and a small step into the right direction is better than no steps at all. And improvements can be made further down the line.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you on that. But still, there are some questions and concerns open regarding which refugees are granted asylum. So here, climate refugees, for instance, are not named. And I think this could become a real issue in the future, and already now to a certain degree. And in general, I find this ranking, in quotation marks, and of the type of refugees, also in quotation marks, quite strange and problematic. Many of the speakers in the parliament who are in favor of the new pact highlighted solidarity. But this is only true for the EU itself and not really for the refugees, especially for those who will have to return.
Agreed. In the future, climate refugees will be an even bigger issue with the climate temperatures rising every day, and it might be time to include those people fleeing from climate-related issues to the list of refugees in the Geneva Convention. However, I also see the point of solidarity a bit different. Yes, the solidarity for migrants who will have to return, this is a different issue, but regarding the EU itself, I believe that the compulsory solidarity is a huge benefit because it would take a lot of pressure from the external borders, and the border countries like Greece or Italy would be relieved by the fair distribution of refugees across all the member states. And this is definitely a step into the right direction, especially since the EU is built on solidarity among its states, and the Dublin system, which was implemented before, was definitely not built on these values.
Yeah, true. I see your point. But still, I find it difficult to assess what outweighs here. So I do believe there definitely are some improvements that could be made in favor of the asylum seekers, as rightly pointed out by the left in the parliament, for example.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. It's a complex issue. And something else that is also connected to solidarity is the possible infringement of human rights, more especially the right to asylum for the migrants.
Yeah, true. And another issue that relates to what you just said, kinda, is that the hotspots of arrival will stay the same. We named Italy and Greece before, and the refugees will probably still arrive there. And although the new pact states that the camps at the arrival points will have adequate living standards, I think that especially in the beginning of the implementation, this might not be the case. And also in the future, this could become a problem if too many people arrive at the same time and the same place, because this would then also lead to conditions that might not fulfill the human rights standard.
Yeah, true.
And at the same time, the issues with the hotspots staying the same could, on top of this, create some problems with the screening of the people and with the time frame the EU has set for this. And in addition, it will also increase the levels of bureaucracy, I could imagine, and in general also administrative work, which could result into a loss of efficiency. And this might also be connected with higher costs. And all these ambitions just seem a bit high to my mind.
Yeah, the ambitions are definitely very high, but I think that can also be a good thing, because in order to meet these ambitions, it's necessary to make big changes, which are necessary at the moment. And if all things work out according to the plan, then the results would be a more efficient and fast asylum process, and this would have benefits for both sides, for the EU and the migrants themselves, as long procedures are extremely tedious for them.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, and now let's just briefly talk about the statements of Van den Driesche for a moment, because he puts the EU on a pedestal and thus presents the typical narrative of the far right, where they create us versus the other scenario. And it seems like he believes that the EU is in a vacuum and should just stand on its own, basically. And he does not really acknowledge the fact that migration has always happened and is a reality that everybody has to deal with. And closing the borders is definitely not the solution for this, right?
Definitely not. I think the reasoning of the far right is absolutely disgusting in my opinion. They completely go against the human rights which the EU is eager to protect, and which is the goal which they're built on. And fortunately, the pact went through, even though it can be further improved, but a start is at least a start. However, I think it's crucial to stress the possible political tensions that might occur within the European Union, especially with the rise of right-winged parties and their establishment in the national parliaments that we mentioned in the beginning. like in Italy or in Austria. I think the divergence of opinions regarding migration and asylum could lead to like really, really difficult discussions and more pushbacks on the reform if they don't want to implement it. Like if the far right parties stay true to their political affiliation and their current state standpoints, like the one from the Member of Parliament from the ED, then they will do anything to sabotage the pact and also hinder any other improvements towards more humane refugee policies.
Oh yes, I think this is a concern one should not underestimate. And another issue that just came up to my mind is the lack of support for the home countries of the refugees. These people did not just leave their country of origin for fun, but had serious reasons for that decision. And in order to regulate the numbers of refugees, the EU could also implement further and more drastic measures to help fight the causes of migration. And I think this would be highly beneficial for the future for basically everybody.
Yeah, good point. Really good point. There are many reasons to flee from one's home country, which we briefly touched upon earlier, such as war, racism, homophobia, or now climate crisis, and many other more reasons. So, Lisa, what do you think? Is the new pact on migration and asylum a step into the right direction, or do the disadvantages that we just discussed overweigh?
Yeah, Sebastian, I think that is rather difficult to assess for me, actually. On the one hand, I do believe that the reform poses many concerns, such as the possible infringement of the right to asylum and the question if the pact will in fact be as efficient as it promises, as well as whether it really does promote solidarity, and if so, for whom. But on the other hand, it will definitely be an improvement to the Dublin system. And especially the redistribution should be mentioned as an advantage, since it takes a lot of pressure from the countries at the external borders of the EU. And this is a step into the right direction, I believe.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a start and certainly better than prolonging the discussion on the pact for even more years. And I'm happy that the pact went through, and further improvements can and definitely should also be made in the future. And I think Marquez said it really well. This is the moment where Europe stops dragging its feet on migration and starts to change at least something.
Yeah. So, as you listeners could hear now, the new Migration and Asylum Pact is a complex reform and was and still is highly discussed. It aims to address long-standing issues in the EU migration policy, but faces significant political and practical changes and challenges.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us in this discussion. This, unfortunately, our last and also only episode on this channel, Policy Popcorn, but we hope you enjoyed it.
Bye!